everyone. Welcome to League of Leaders. I'm Zach Sooty. We have Al Fragnoli and our special guest, Dr. Will Ramey. Will, thank you for being here. Appreciate your time. And before we get into today's conversation about toxic leadership, Al and I are very excited to discuss this. Wanted to give our listeners and our viewers a little bit of an intro of who Dr. Will Ramey is. So Will grew up in the Still Valley of Northeast Ohio. He enlisted in the National Guard in 1998 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 2003. He has an eye-opening 10-year career in uniform, serving as a military policeman, logistics officer, and space operations officer, deploying to Iraq, serving all across our country and leading a variety of teams. He has worked in the commercial sector for Target Corporation in the distribution operation. Will currently serves as a Department of Army civilian. He is entering into entrepreneurship as a speaker, author, and leadership development trainer. His 22 years in leadership positions have been a thorough experiential education in influence, perspective, and lifelong learning. Will was fortunate to continue his education along the way, completing his undergrad work in criminal justice, graduate work in business administration, and your doctoral work in business administration with a focus on leadership and organizational behavior. So once again, Will, thank you for being here and really appreciate you sharing your studies and your expertise in toxic leadership today.
Sure thing, Al and Zach. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to have a conversation.
All right, so Dr. Will Ramey, want to jump into this and just give our listeners a background of who you are, and if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional background.
Yeah, sure thing. You hit the highlights there, but when it comes down to it, I'm a family-oriented person. I grew up in Northeast Ohio. I've lived, 7 different places with my wife. I've been married for 19 years, and we've got 3 wonderful kids from 16 down to 10 years old. And, I've led teams. That's been my career. And thinking about this podcast and, reflecting on a few things after I finished my, doctorate was interesting. I've led teams, and I've never actually done the work of the functional work of the team that I've led. So I've had a career in leading people and, learning how to build relationships and maximize relationships and influence people and bring teams together, which drove me to continue my education. And like you said, I just finished my doctorate. I go down June 10th to Drexel University and go through the ceremony down there. And I did my dissertation on disrupting the trickle-down effect of abusive supervision. To me, that was an interesting topic of leadership when we think about how formal leaders provide influence and how they bring people together, or how they don't, right? And there's been some studies out there. Most recently, McKinsey released one of their studies on leadership and the importance of relationships with management. And they said an employee's job satisfaction was tied to their relationship with their manager. And of those people, 75% reported having a negative relationship with their manager, or not ideal relationship with their manager. And they were the top stressor. That manager was the top stressor in that employee's life, at least work life, I should say. So, the importance is there on how we lead and how we learn, and that's really who I am, and what I'm exploring these days with education and dynamics in the workplace.
That's awesome, Will. Thanks for sharing a little bit of your background with us, and congratulations on getting your doctoral work done there. So that's a huge accomplishment right there. Being from Ohio, I don't want to put you on the spot, but are you a Buckeye?
Yeah, so I'm a Buckeyes fan. I'm a Browns fan. I'm an Indians fan. I'm a hometown kid. So yeah, anything
okay,
up Cleveland's way.
All right. Well, we won't talk anymore about the Buckeyes. We're going to move into our next question here, Will. So you've done a lot of research, obviously, on toxic leadership, as you alluded to, but talk to us a little bit about what toxic leadership is. What interested you about toxic leadership that made it the subject of your dissertation?
Sure. So, taking a step back, if you look at leadership and how it can be described, it's the ability to influence people to accomplish a shared goal. And leaders provide that influence through their behaviors, their attitudes, and how they build relationships. So what I came across during my research was that these two constructs of leadership, constructive leadership behaviors, things like transformational leadership or empowering leadership, these are the good. And then you have destructive leadership behaviors. So toxic leadership falls into this realm of destructive leadership behaviors. It's things like abusive supervision. So ridiculing or belittling, team members, or calling them out in public or threatening their jobs. Authoritarian, style behaviors where you have to have control over every aspect of work. You have to make every decision. You have to control how work is being done. You're basically taking creativity and innovation away from your employees. Self-promoting behavior, narcissism. You are a different person when your own boss is there. You take credit for other people's works. You deny mistakes of your team, and you're focused on what is coming next and what the next step is before you're even there. And then lastly is unpredictable behavior, that erratic behavior, right? Most employees, they crave, predictability and consistency throughout their day, and leaders can provide that through their behaviors. But if you're, upset because you didn't bring creamer for your coffee that day and you're going to take it out on your team, or if you've got somebody that's coming to you with a problem and they're guessing how you're going to react to that, today, those types of behaviors fall into that construct of toxic leadership. So what interested me about that with my dissertation was really talking to one of my professors, Rajiv Nag, fantastic person, was doing qualitative work with him. And he really brought out that some of the phenomenon of places that I've worked isn't normal, isn't the usual. And that there's this darker side to leadership that, when you come into to work for the day, your leaders should be providing you with a positive work environment, with purpose, with meaningful work, removing roadblocks. But look at the statistics of people that are not happy with the relationship they have with their boss. And there has to be something that we can do as scholarly practitioners, as researchers, to get out in the field, understand more about why leaders lead with this set of behaviors, and what can be done about it. And that's what drew me to my research topic.
That's all fantastic stuff. And you mentioned the darker side of leadership, and you just think of Darth Vader, who had the Jedi powers, using them for the wrong reasons, if you will. So, a little Star Wars joke there for you.
Yeah.
But what consequences can a team or an organization have when toxic leadership is present?
So when we think about consequences, they can happen at different levels. So for individuals that are experiencing toxic leadership, the consequences can range from physical health decline, psychological distress, and it can spill over into your family and family well-being. Think about that person on a Sunday night who's just in knots about having to go back to work the next day. They're not enjoying time with their family. They're not sleeping well at night, and that cycle continues. That individual, at work, then research has shown that those people they can develop retaliatory behaviors to where they're, not as engaged, and even worse, they're slow rolling work. They're taking longer breaks and lunches. They definitely have lower job satisfaction. They don't feel safe taking risks. And that leads to team performance. So consequences at a team level, can range into less psychological safety, the willingness to make mistakes and the willingness to take risk and try new things. When that's not there, the team's not performing and it's not evolving. So when people are just trying to have their head down and survive their work week and get through their day because of this toxic boss, performance lags, attrition rates increase. So you start to get into organizational effects. You have higher attrition rates. You have higher cost to healthcare. Maybe you have a industrial organizational psychologist on staff to help deal with the stress of the work and the workplace, which really can be maybe tied back to a toxic leader. There was a study I read 2014 that came out that annual cost of abusive or toxic leadership across U.S. corporations was $28 billion, billion with a B. So when we look at just, not just the direct effect of my boss is a jerk and how am I going to get through my day, it's that long-term effect that this destructive behavior has on individuals and families and teams, and then eventually organizations.
That's scary stuff right there. That's amazing. All the consequences that can come out of a toxic work environment, a toxic leader, and you mentioned the family life too, right? So it doesn't just stop at work. Sometimes it carries over into your home life, which is definitely a consequence of a toxic leader. Moving on into our next question, what can young employees or leaders do if you have a toxic leader or your organization has toxic leadership?
Yeah, so this is interesting, and research is just starting to dive into this and bring this out, right? So a few things that I found in my research and other studies I've read. First off is you gotta prepare your mind. You gotta develop your mindset, right? So learn and goal orientation, armor yourself up with, well, what can I learn? When you think about things, your boss and your relationship with work anymore, they're fluid and they're changing and it's temporary, right? What are the odds that you're going to stay on the same team with the same boss throughout your career? So when you think about what can I learn from the situation? What can I take away? How can I become stronger and navigate through this? That learning goal orientation of seeing these stressors as a challenge to be overcome. That's the mindset that you want. You want to continuously assess different ways to overcome that obstacle of working for that toxic leader. And then the next thing that you can do is really dive into proactive coping. So proactive coping is a positive form of coping after you initially assess and appraise a stress in the workplace. And this specific stress would be that toxic leader. So when you look to start proactive coping, you want to use initiative and plan and prepare for stressful interactions. So you know it's coming. You use your support system to vent, reflect, and gain perspective. So who are the colleagues that you can go to? Who can you trust on your team to where you can not only vent, but get their perspective and then try to help navigate that situation better? What resources are around you? How can you armor yourself up with knowledge about what this person wants, or what drives them, or how do they want information presented to them, or how do they react to things typically, right? So you start looking at getting ahead of the problem, and meeting that challenge and rising to it and working through that person or around that person with leveraging your network and your work support or your family support. Then you can move to understanding the power dynamics at work. And this is interesting because you have to understand that power is fluid. That toxic leader wants to have you think that they hold all the power and they hold all the cards. But in today's work environment, they rely on that team performing just as much as the team relies on them for guidance. So when you shift your mindset to understand that, you leverage an approach to balance the power dynamic out. You build positive coalitions with your team around you. So things like increasing your subject matter expertise at your job, and then sharing that information with others, finding complementary skills that you have with people on your team and working together. So then one individual that may be targeted or maybe getting separated now becomes 2 individuals, now becomes 3 individuals on that team. So you start to shift that power of, hey, there's no target here. It's us. It's not me, it's we. And then you dive into understanding corporate policies, understanding process. You become almost indispensable to that leader to where they need to rely on you to get the job done. So when you have that learning goal orientation, that growth mindset, you armor yourself up to proactively cope with the situation, and then you build your coalition around you to leverage that power and balance that power out. The next thing that you could attempt to do, and it really depends on the level of toxicity and the intent of that leader, would be to give that direct upward feedback. I think sometimes leaders are not self-aware. They don't realize the impact they're having on people. They don't necessarily realize how they're behaving and the impact that it has, especially if they're a younger leader. They may not have a lot of experience. They may just be modeling behavior of someone that they've seen or someone they want to emulate. and they're doing this directive thing because, well, it's worked for them. Well, did it work for them, or did they just leave a wake of turmoil behind them, right? So have that courage to give that upward feedback and that straight talk to your boss. That awareness to that destructive behavior. Hey, do you realize, like, when you're in a meeting and you ask questions, you cut me off 3 times, and when someone tries to answer your question, you raise your voice and escalate, and when you do that, everyone shuts down. They may not realize that might be either their passion or their overexerted enthusiasm or their over assertiveness coming out, and they aren't necessarily being toxic with malicious intent, but until someone brings that awareness to them, they may not have that. But that direct upward feedback is probably the most difficult thing for an employee to do with a boss or supervisor. So if you work on the other 3, you'll have, I believe you'll build that courage up around you to give that feedback.
That is great stuff. I love so many things that you mentioned, and my notes are a little messy, but you talked about the growth mindset. But the direct upward feedback is something that is difficult for many individuals. But when you provided the example, one thing that I really recognized was you were specific in how to address that leader, in saying that, did you know you cut me off 3 times and you raised your voice, to call out the actual behavior. And I think that's what most people don't like to do and are afraid to do, is calling the specific behavior and just saying in general that they're not a good leader. My boss isn't a good leader. How though? What are they doing? And I love that direct upward feedback and being specific with that example. So so many great things that you said, but loved all of it. So thank you very much. Now, I have another question, and I hope the answer is yes, and you're going to share a little bit more. But is it beneficial to have a toxic leader in your career, if only to have that experience to learn what not to do when you have the opportunity to lead?
Yeah, I think so. So looking back and thinking back about my experience as a leader, and then thinking about some of the research I did, there's a few different theories on leadership and learning. Social learning theory, when is one that comes to mind. So when you're learning to lead, or when you're working in an organization, you are taking in these cues about the people around you. And social learning theory says you're going to observe behavior and then follow that behavior on. So I think that in a way it's good, right? I also came across a divergent theory, a cognitive affective theory, and that talked about when you are learning and you're in situations, you take in all these aspects of the situation. So your work environment, your boss's behavior, and then inside of you, these cognitive affective mediating units are combining. So your emotions, your values, your beliefs, your mindset, they're coming together, and that's what drives follow-on behavior. So if you've worked for a toxic leader, or you worked for a toxic boss, you're banking that experience, and your emotional intelligence or your goal orientation or your appraisal of stress is gonna come together and say, that's not how I want to lead. And then you'll learn follow-on behaviors. How do I armor up? How do I cope? Do I leave an organization, right? So there's, in my mind, there's good to come. There's been no tie to higher performance, but I think personally, growth as a person, there's benefit to working at least once for a toxic leader, to know what that feels like, know what that experience is. Because if you get into leadership, then you'll know what not to do. You'll hopefully have more self-awareness of the effect that you have on people. If you're working for a company, maybe you get to change teams and find something else to do in that company, in that organization, or you'll find somebody else who's experiencing the same thing, and you'll share that experience with them and become stronger and more cohesive because of it, and work together in spite of that leader, around that leader. So I do think there's some benefit, and if you didn't think so, hopefully you'll hear this and and maybe take some of that away.
Will, I love your response to that question. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that that it does help to see what a toxic leader does to you emotionally, and just mentally, and then it teaches you what not to do when you have that opportunity to lead. So I love your answer to that question there. Going on into our next question, you alluded to leaders not always being self-aware, and they don't know sometimes if they're doing something wrong or leading the wrong way. How does an individual know if they're a toxic leader?
Yeah, so there's a few cues that I've picked up along the way. I've read about along the way. Colin Powell, and I'm going to paraphrase one of his quotes is, when soldiers stop bringing you problems, there's a sign there, right? So when your employees stop approaching you, when they stop being cordial, when they stop bringing problems and are only asking for direction, if they're apprehensive about of things, right? Those are all signs that your relationships need work. And most likely, what do those relationships need work? Because of your behavior. I'm a firm believer that a leader extends the first olive branch. They make the first move. They make the move to make their employees comfortable. So if you start seeing things that pop up where your employees are distancing themselves from you, your peers are asking, hey, are you okay? And you don't think anything's wrong, maybe you need to dig into that beyond surface level and ask it, why did you ask me that? What are you thinking? And have that conversation, right? Because I think that self-awareness is key. But when you look at cues for, am I a toxic leader? Take a step back and reflect on your day. If you find yourself having eruptions at work, or trouble controlling your temper, or you find yourself with a stack of papers this high on your desk because you have to have the final say and authority sign off on every little thing. When you find yourself, just pulsing from meeting to meeting and having erratic behavior, those are all signs, right? But I think one of the early indicators is, how are your employees engaging with you? And are they bringing you issues? Are they asking for help? Are they bringing solutions with those issues? Are they communicating with you? That's probably an early indicator of a relationship that needs repair. And then when you self-reflect on those things, it might point back to some of the toxic leadership behaviors that we discussed.
So, to follow up with our last question, we kind of just went through what are the characteristics of a toxic leader, but what characteristics or qualities should I practice so that I don't become a toxic leader? What is a good leader? And I like to focus on, what you can do rather than what you can't do. So what can I do to be a good leader rather than a toxic leader?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Zach. When we look at leadership, especially in this day and age, work is getting more complex, fast-paced, agile, dynamic, and it's full of unknowns, right? So leaders are, formal leaders specifically, are in positions where they can't know everything. So when you are influencing people, having that ability to just state that, hey, I'm the leader of the organization, I'm the leader of this team, I'm not an expert, you know your job better than I do. Even if I've done your job before, it was X years ago, you know it better than I do today. So you start bringing people together, and you start creating an environment where it's okay to make mistakes. We focus on progress, not perfection. And a leader gives a team purpose. They give them meaningful work. Why are we here, and how do we fit into the overall organization? Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, it comes from empowering leadership behaviors. What's our purpose of this team, and what does meaningful work look like in your day? How do you contribute to the overall good? Then a leader is going to remove roadblocks. They're going to talk to you and bring you in to be a participant in the decision-making process on how work gets done. So as they're having those conversations on, how can I help you be more effective, be more efficient? How can I help you perform better? Those employees are going to come up with ideas. They're going to come to you with things. Take them on, and if you can get just even one of them done, you're going to build leadership capital with your team. Remove those roadblocks. Do what you can to leverage resources, right? So you're building purpose. You're bringing people in to be inclusive in that environment. You're giving them a voice and a safe environment to try new things, to create. You're working with them to remove roadblocks, to get them resources that they need. and you start to shape this team of togetherness, right? And then if you can elevate that to a place where everyone's got a voice, they're an expert in their function, and we start to see synergy of people working together, playing off each other, they start sharing this leadership load. And to me, that's the next elevation of how to bring teams together. It's team dynamics and teamwork, but leaders do that through their behavior, right? And then one of the pieces that's probably a little uncomfortable for some is that connection piece. You've got to genuinely care about your people. You've got to genuinely care about your team. What are they doing this weekend? How was it? You follow up on Monday. Hey, how was your weekend? How was the fishing trip? Did you catch anything? How was that kid's recital last night? Oh, Billy's getting so big. He's playing saxophone these days, right? So these are things. I have these conversations with my team at work because I genuinely care. I care about them. I care about what they do. If you put their needs first and you put the needs of the organization right there with them, the results will come. And I think too many times toxic leaders are focused on getting the results. And I think when we look at empowering leaders, they're focused on giving purpose and bringing people together, and the results will come through that shared sense of why.
Wow. Dr. Will Ramey, thank you very much. You shared so much today that there's so much to take away from this. And that final question of, you mentioned, humility, bringing people together. I love to use the phrase leadership capital, from a business perspective, progress, not perfection. There's so many takeaways from what you shared with us today. I want to say thank you for joining us today, and it was a pleasure. And we hope to talk to you real soon. And everyone, keep your eye on Dr. Will Ramey. He is going to be up and coming as a leadership coach, and we hope you check him out. LinkedIn, social media, we'll share some of his contact information, and check him out, and hope you enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Will. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Zach. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.